Okay, and welcome everybody. And we're going to start off this morning with a really fantastic session on advancing diverse stories with folks from the Old Stonehouse Museum and from our intern as well, Rehana. And so I think I will presumably turn it over to Mahala to start.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to get my screen shared with our slides up and then give a little bit of background as to sort of how this team came together for this presentation. So this sort of conversation started today with Rehana and I looking at this topic of diverse stories in Vermont and sort of, how we could go about having this discussion, the idea of advancing these diverse stories, bringing them more to the forefront. And so we kind of came together looking at Alexander Twilight, whose story we tell at the Old Stonehouse Museum, as sort of a case study of that topic. So the presentation you're going to be seeing today, those of us from the Old Stonehouse are going to be talking about the different ways that we do this with Twilight's story. We really do this as a team at the museum, so there's different components of the way that we go about that as an institution that each of us as individual staff members within that team cover. And then Rehana is going to sort of tie that all together, talk about how that case study might relate and, some takeaways from that. So Bob is going to start us off, and I'll let each of us introduce ourselves more specifically with our sections. But Bob is going to start us off with some background on Twilight, so you all have some context moving forward as we talk about some of these larger questions. So I'm going to hand that off to him. Get us started.
Thank you, Mahala. And I'm going to start with a little background information on Alexander Twilight. There is still, quite a lot of mystery surrounding Alexander Twilight and a lot yet to be learned. It certainly was exciting this year to get a proclamation from the state of Vermont and a new state holiday honoring Twilight, and a new state historic marker that focused on Twilight. We're proud of the fact that we are part of the Vermont African American Heritage Trail, and we celebrate Twilight's African American ancestry. But we also have to be sensitive to the fact that, we're not really sure how Alexander Twilight might have felt about that he didn't seem to identify, but we do celebrate his ancestry, and even more so the fact that he was a noted progressive educator who sent hundreds of students to the West full of lofty ideals. So Mahala, if you'd go to the next slide, I'll just give a little background information. So the records indicate that Twilight was of mixed race, and it's clear that he was very light complected, which may well have obscured his partially African-American origins. He was born either in Bradford or Corinth, Vermont on September 23rd, 1795, the third of 6 children. His parents were Ichabod and Mary Twilight, who were both listed in the Corinth town history as the first Negroes to settle in Corinth. Not much is known about his parents, other than the fact that Ichabod served during the Revolutionary War from 1782 to 83 as a private in the Continental Army, 2nd New Hampshire Regiment, 6th Company. There have been many guesses about Ichabod and Mary's background. Example given that they were freed slaves or were descendants of same, that they were the result of racially mixed unions, and that the name of Twilight was taken because of their light complexion. These are all guesses that may one day be resolved with more research. It appears that Alexander labored for a neighboring farmer in Corinth, probably beginning around 1803 when he was about 8 years old. For the next 12 years, he learned reading, writing, and math skills while performing various farming duties. He was able to save enough, probably with some assistance from the farmer whom he labored, to enroll in Randolph's Orange County Grammar School in 1815 at the age of 20. During the next 6 years, he completed not only the secondary school course, but also the first 2 years of a college-level curriculum. Following his graduation from Randolph, he was accepted at Middlebury College, entering as a junior in August of 1821. 2 years later, he received his bachelor's degree. Middlebury claims him to be the first African American to earn a baccalaureate from an American college or university. From 1824 to 1828, Twilight was employed as a teacher in Peru, New York, where he met and married Mercy Ladd Merrill, who came from a family of some means in Unity, New Hampshire. At the time of their marriage in 1826, Alexander was 31 and Mercy was 21 or 22 years of age. In addition to his teaching duties, Alexander continued studies that focused on theology, the church, and ministry, occasionally leading public worship and preaching. He was licensed to preach by the Champlain Presbytery in Plattsburgh, New York. After 4 years of teaching in Peru, he moved across Lake Champlain to teach in Vergennes, where he spent weekends holding services in the neighboring towns of Waltham and Ferrisburgh. After a year in Vergennes, Twilight was invited to become the principal of the Orleans County Grammar School in Brownington, Vermont. The Orleans County Grammar School. The school was a two-story frame schoolhouse located on the Hinman Settler Road at the top of the hill, now known as Prospect Hill. It had been established 6 years earlier in 1823 and was supported by state land rents collected within the county. Students came from Orleans County's newly settled towns, and pupils were housed and boarded in the neighboring homes in Brownington. This was not a town school, but as with other grammar schools of the period, a college preparatory and teacher training school intended to serve older children, both male and female, offering classes in astronomy, trigonometry, algebra, geology, and history and philosophy, as well as English, French, Latin, and Greek. When Twilight arrived in Brownington in 1829 to be principal of the school, he was also invited to become the Brownington Congregational Church's acting pastor and was ordained by the church in November 1829. In 1831, he led the church in conducting a revival, which resulted in membership increasing to as many as 100 who covenanted to be in fellowship. Upon their arrival in Brownington, the Twilights moved into a small three-room house a few hundred yards to the east of the school building. He at once set about building a larger home in front of this small dwelling so that the couple could accommodate as many as 9 or 10 boarding students. This is now the Alexander Twilight House, where the gift shop and museum offices are located. Enrollment in the school grew so fast that classroom space and available accommodations in town were being taxed. Twilight pressed his board of trustees for a larger building, but failed to receive support from the majority. Finally, in 1834, he resigned as acting pastor of the church and laid out a foundation plan for land donated by Cyrus Eaton across the road from the Twilight House. It called for a four-story granite building measuring 36 by 66 feet. Over the following 2 years, the present stone house was erected following the lines and general appearance of a similar building, quite possibly Painter Hall at Middlebury College. Next. The first 3 floors featured a kitchen, dining room, music parlor, 14 student rooms, and 6 recitation rooms. The 4th floor consisted of 2 classrooms, one a 20 by 40-foot assembly room, which was probably large enough to accommodate the entire student body. As with other grammar schools of the period, females comprised a third of the student body. It is not known how the building was funded. One source, the Reverend Clark Farron, a pastor in Barton, writing in 1868, reports that on his own resources he set to work and built the granite house. Others suggest that Cyrus Eaton, who had just built on adjacent land, loaned Twilight the substantial funds necessary to finance construction. However, it was financed. The granite was harvested from nearby fields, and the building slowly emerged. It's likely not all the granite was harvested from nearby fields. Some of it must have been quarried, possibly coming from Derby. But anyway, it was named Athenian Hall and was ready for occupancy in 1836. This was also the year that Twilight was sent by the town as its representative to the state legislature in Montpelier. He wanted to persuade his fellow legislators that the land rents, which supported the Orleans County Grammar School, should not be divided between that school and the town of Craftsbury, which had decided to have its own school. Twilight argued that one good school was better than two not-so-good schools. If the county's resources for education were to be split two ways, there could follow more schools which would become increasingly mediocre. It appears that he lost this battle, for Craftsbury was granted its petition to receive funds for its own grammar school. The 1836 legislative session began on October 15th and came to an end only 6 weeks later. Some of the artifacts from the school. Here's Twilight's house. In 1842, the house that had been the Twilight's home for the past 13 years, built when they first moved to Brownington, was sold. The reasons for selling the property are unknown, but it's possible that he was financially overextended. In 1844, his contract with the school was renewed at a higher salary, and in 1846, he resumed his services to the Congregational Church as acting pastor. It seems likely that the Twilights moved into the stone house, remaining there through 1847. We know that there were disputes with the school's trustees and with the church's deacons, both groups reprimanding him for various faults, including a stubborn lack of cooperation. This led Twilight to resign from both positions, selling Athenian Hall to the school's trustees and leaving Brownington to teach in a ship in Quebec, now Richmond, and later to Hatley, Quebec, a village just a few miles north of the United States border. Without Twilight's leadership, the school limped along until the fall of 1851, led by the Reverend William Scales, who also served the church as pastor. Then for 3 terms, the school was closed until the summer of 1852. At this time, Twilight was persuaded by both church and school to resume his Brownington duties. He continued in the church's pulpit for only 1 more year and then resigned. He continued to lead the grammar school in October 1855, at which time he suffered a major stroke which left him paralyzed. He died 2 years later and was buried in the graveyard adjoining the Congregational Church. Comments from those who knew this gifted educator and minister either as resident students of the school or from those who associated with him as neighbor, citizen, and clergyman all indicate a man of iron will, but who was also graced with a robust sense of humor. Some comments from students and others are on display on the second floor wall of the stone house. His handwritten notes for sermons that he preached reveal a minister who was thoroughly acquainted with the Bible, which he considered to be of divine origin. He clearly was a man of firm convictions and hoped to convince any who heard him to be persuaded of what he had to say. He saw human history as progressive, directed by God, ever bending toward an increase in individual freedom, which was guided by conscience and which he viewed as inestimable treasure, given to man by his munificent creator as an inalienable inheritance. He regarded slavery as a relic of older civilizations and considered it to be out of place in a Christian democracy. But as far as we know, he refrained from being active in local abolition groups. He preached in favor of total abstinence from alcohol. Vermont officially became a temperance state in 1852. Due to diminishing school enrollment, Athenian Hall was closed for good in 1859. For a brief time, Mercy Ladd Merrill continued to live there with a few boarders. She then continued alone until finally moving to Derby in 1865. When she died in 1878, she was buried next to her husband in Brownington. Here's one of my favorite letters. I think it's in the collection of the Vermont Historical Society, and it's from Erastus Fairbanks, governor of Vermont and part of the illustrious Fairbanks family of St. Johnsbury. But he's writing to his son, George, who was a student of Twilight's in the early days of Twilight's headmastership. It's St. Johnsbury, October 16th, 1830. Dear George, it gives me great pleasure to reflect that Providence has enabled me to place you where you have such advantage for improvement. You have before now become acquainted with your excellent preceptor, Mr. Twilight, and I am persuaded that you will try to merit his goodwill and esteem. I was gratified to see you exercise such manliness when you went away, and I hope you will continue to feel and to act like one who is preparing for business and for usefulness in life. Do not think so much of home as to prevent your attending to your studies. Strive to feel happy in your situation and to make others happy. Be careful that you are not led away by the advice of boys, if there be any, who are disobedient and wicked. From your father, affectionate father, E. Fairbanks. And here's James W. Strong, who was a Brownington boy who arose to become president of Carleton College. And he says, Mr. Twilight was an excellent teacher. He secured not only the respect, but the sincere esteem of his pupils. In that old academy, many young men were filled with lofty ambitions and stimulated to noble attainments. And in them he still lives, a mighty and abiding power for good in the world. James W. Strong. And here is Edward Amherst Stewart, Brownington boy, also businessman of Newport, founder of the Newport Express. He says, who could ever forget him? That pursy rotund form, the inevitable calico gown, the bronzed but mirth-provoking face, the jest-loving propensity, the perennial fun, sometimes breaking out in the midst of the schoolroom, the abrupt, contagious but quiet laugh, his success in finding out mischief, his enterprise, his writhing rebuke when he saw anything of a low, mean character, and his strong friendships. You can next slide. Thank you, Mahala.
Thank you, Bob. So hello, everyone. My name is Mahala Nyberg, and within the context of what we're talking about today, I serve as sort of the frontline coordinator at the Old Stone House. So as you learned from Bob's presentation, Twilight is a huge part of what we do at the Old Stone House, but he is just one story that we tell. We also serve as the Orleans County Historical Society. So last year, our board at the museum actually voted to make Twilight's story more of the forefront narrative that we tell at the museum, and that's what's come to be known as the Twilight Initiative. And I don't know at the time that we could have predicted just how relevant Twilight's story would be this year in particular, but it certainly has been. And as someone pointed out to me recently, our museum really wouldn't exist without Twilight and his determination. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the sort of tangible pieces of the Twilight Initiative, the ways that it really came to the forefront this summer, what some of the goals were. So really it was bringing his story to the forefront, but over the course of the summer and the season, that really developed into some of these broader discussions in the context of what was happening this year with sort of the regrowth of the Black Lives Matter movement, discussions about diversity, equity and inclusion, and how we could use Twilight's story to really serve as a point of education around those different conversations. So probably the most tangible way that this happened was with his birthday celebration. So on September 23rd, Twilight turned 225 years old. Among many other things, the state passed a resolution making his birthday an official holiday. We revealed a new historic marker, and we had sort of a combination of virtual and limited in-person events happening to celebrate Twilight, to tell his story. It wasn't, of course, what we had originally planned, but with COVID, we adapted, and I think the way that it turned out was even better than we imagined. We had a lot of really interesting conversations. We had some great programs going on. A couple that I want to highlight are the ways that we really delved into his story and tackled some of these more difficult questions, particularly when it comes to places where people start to get start to question his role, his racial identity, how he might have identified, the way that his story relates to that. So that really came to the forefront in two ways. The first was a community conversation that we held virtually using Google Forms. So we had 3 questions based on our mission statement, asking the community to talk about really what Twilight means to them, why he's important to them. And that sort of word cloud that you're seeing on the right is the results of that community conversation. So it came from our mission statement. It was, how does Twilight inspire you? Why is it important to preserve his story? And what can we learn from his story today? And what's really interesting is that particularly students and children who wrote into this community conversation, they didn't latch on to his racial identity. They didn't latch on to the fact that he was the first African-American graduate in the United States. They latched onto what he chose to do with his life, his determination. So you're seeing words like learn and build, educate, inspire really coming to the forefront of that conversation. So I think it's important to note that, you know, those are the important qualities of his story, and that is also what is proving to be most important to the community, and what they are learning from him as well, as these qualities about determination, persevering, and things like that. The second is this video that was put together. We worked with a team of artists. They are known colloquially as Eve and Steve, but Eve and Steve Schaub worked on an art project with us. They used photos of our grounds and then turned it into this video, writing different information over their photos. You can actually see their exhibit. It's called Unprecedented. It's showing in Burlington right now. I'll drop the link during the questions. But they really sort of interrogated Twilight's story and, you know, what we can learn from it. And in particular, they came to this question, when people look at his race and really latch onto that as part of his story, they came to this conclusion of, we don't really know how he identified. You know, we know what the records tell us. We know that he was of mixed race origins, but we don't know how Twilight identified. And ultimately, what right do we have to interrogate him about his racial identity? You know, what's important is what he did for his students, what he did for Brownington, and ultimately, maybe his racial identity doesn't really matter. That's not why his story is important, but we can certainly learn from that. And, you know, we don't really have a right to interrogate him about that. So that's kind of an interesting question, and one that we were able to sort of bring into our frontline interpretation as well. We were able to use this artwork, this community conversation as a jumping off point to have some of these more difficult questions with visitors. We actually had just private tours this summer. We didn't do big tours, so people had to schedule a pre-appointed tour, and tours were a little more intimate. So I was actually able to use these art platforms and these conversation platforms to fall back on with visitors and tackle some of these more difficult questions with them, but in a way that was a little more intimate and comfortable. So we were able to explore this quite a lot this summer. And then we have a second piece to this that I'm going to pass on to Leela, and she's going to talk about sort of how we're doing this in a more community-related way, less so on the front lines with our museum interpretation.
Thank you, Mahala. My name is Leela Nordman. I'm the Associate Director of Museum Education at the Old Stone House. I came on this summer during COVID and sort of was watching programs that were in progress. So we had actually Kids Friday, and we did sort of a drive-through format, having students pick up their curriculum and materials. So we sort of got to wave to people and continued in-person outdoors programming until the museum closed October, I want to say it was around the 17th, with homeschool pods of students. So trying to continue doing in-person as best we could with the current situation. So my position is currently funded by the Henderson Foundation and Doing Foundation, and it's really looking at new early childhood. It's a new early childhood initiative to reach that 2 to 5 year old age group. Currently, we do well with meeting sort of the 3rd grade through 6th grades, especially with the history standards, and work with those age groups frequently through our school programs and summer camps during a normal season. This pre-kindergarten program is currently having me travel, bringing what I've developed from the Old Stone House Museum to their sites. This age group is ideally needs to have their programs in person as much as possible. Preschoolers don't particularly Zoom well. So I'm doing my best every Monday and Tuesday to actually drive to various different childcare centers and schools where I can be an approved visitor to give our programming. And then the overarching initiative, which Mahala and Bob have also discussed, is integrating Alexander Twilight's story and the African American heritage into our educational programming that we do. And so part of that is being a community member and stakeholder in the Orleans County. I represent the Old Stone House, participating in an online Orleans Central Supervisory Union Equity and Diversity Group that meet bi-monthly. Here they're tackling issues of racial ignorance and curriculum development for pre-K through 12th grade. So that informs some of the education that I can do from the standpoint of the Old Stone House. We also formed a program and education committee made up of staff, trustees, and advisors that meets twice a month on on what our new programming is, to review it, and underneath the Equity and Diversity Initiative. It's an opportunity to check in and collaborate our programs to continue meeting the unified message that the Old Stone House is putting out through tours, education, and discussion in general. And then with the pre-K, so we're focusing on younger children with pre-K to introduce them to Alexander Twilight, and then thinking about those 5th through 8th grades, questioning Twilight on that sort of complicated question of why he did not self-identify as African American. We ask those questions based on ideas by looking at civics, history, geography, and economics of the 1800s. It's a big question to ask, and certainly one that I grapple with as an educator of how best to approach it. And now just for those slides that we have up there, I started with 3 programs for the pre-K that represent the Old Stone House. So incorporating them into the Vermont Early Learning Standards. So those classes looking at slate as one of them, and chalkboards, another one looking at squash and pumpkins, various different things that have grown at the Old Stone House. And then the third is the actual Old Stone House itself. So let's see, I think we're on the second slide here where, oops, sorry. Yeah, so those are the sort of the 3 initial programs that I was introducing. And then the second slide is showing an actual in-person, in-class introduction of those squash and pumpkins. It's a timely class representing what we grow over the summer, and growing your own food may have been a part of some of the chores that may have been done in Twilight's time. So here we're introducing, you can see a sort of a green pumpkin and an orange pumpkin, sort of the growth and time that it takes, and also what's inside of those pumpkins. So asking those students those questions. And then in the third slide, we're presenting those Squash and Pumpkins, along with reading a story from Seed to Pumpkin by Wendy Pfeffer, and then putting together the life cycle of a pumpkin with images here. So you can see the students are actually trying to do the entire life cycle with those small images. Finally, tools are introduced such as rulers and balances or scales in order to measure and weigh the pumpkins and squash as a part of those early childhood, or the VELs, those early standards. But these 3 programs are to lay the foundation for discussion about who Twilight is and what the old stone house is. The hope is to build up to a discussion of diversity with these young students. They want to build up, they will know a bit about the old stone house physically from the objects that I've brought in, but now I'm thinking of developing a program that will ask them to look at themselves and who they think they are. So I'm building up a rapport with both the teachers and the students to bring in a program of looking at self-portraits, so relating again to that portrait that will be done of Twilight, and this idea of thinking about people colors for young children. So, you know, we may have labels for ourselves of black, white, brown, but this is to show everyone is really a mix of colors and not just white, black, or brown. The idea for young children to build identity and some self-awareness for these students in these classes, and have them create their own self-portraits with sort of human skin colors, and realize not a single color represents them, but many colors combined. And this is actually, education is a lot about, you know, borrowing and enhancing someone else's ideas. And so these were ideas that I learned from a website called tolerance.org, and they just had it's a great resource if this is a direction that you're going in for your own historical site. But I really liked the idea that we're trying to help children develop a sense of pride and language in describing their own heritage, exploring differences of all kinds, building the children's notion of fairness to create a sense of justice and capacity and recognize bias, and helping children to find ways of confronting and eliminating biases they encounter. So in wrapping up, I'm intrigued by Alexander Twilight, first and foremost as an educator, even before we throw in the complications of race. He was teaching STEM classes of astronomy, natural history, you know, various geology, all at a time that was not particularly the focus of Victorian education. So I just find him incredibly inspiring. And again, that determinism and all of the things that Bob and Mahala had spoken about him, I just find very inspiring. And he's someone to definitely admire and get his story out there to the general public through education. Thank you.
Hi, so my name is Rehana, and I'm a student at Smith College, and I worked as an intern for the Vermont Historical Society this summer. And I did some work around sort of diversifying and, you know, exploring diverse stories of Vermonters. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunities that thinking about Alexander Twilight's story presents us with. And I think Twilight's story is one among many other stories that have not traveled through time or been as well documented as his. And one of the advantages of his story is that it's complex, and it leaves us with a lot of questions and even mysteries to explore. So since this story is so multifaceted, and he represents really so many multiple stories, depending on what aspect of his life you focus on, I think he also shows us that different narratives have been more important at one time or another in history. And what we find most important about this story, you know, today and in different contexts, can really reflect the terms and the times that we're living in as well. And with that said, history and education have an important role to play in sharing these diverse stories, and a lot of power to interpret and emphasize narratives. And this power presents us with a myriad of challenges, but also opportunities. And while these challenges are daunting, I don't think they're insurmountable. And yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about a little bit about what some of those might be. So if you can change the slide, Mahala. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is, knowing that this story, Alexander Twilight's story, is well documented in comparison, for example, to the stories of many other African Americans in early Vermont. We have to consider, as we've talked about already, like what some of the circumstances and factors for this were, and whether that be his light complexion and sort of what some might call white passing, or his sort of access to power through education. I think it shows us that education gave him a lot of opportunities, and that he considered that a really important part of his story. So if Twilight is remembered because his story has historically been considered important, as it is today too, we have to understand maybe why that is. And I mean, obviously this is an important story that we can all take a lot from and learn a lot from. But perhaps the narrow definitions of what it means to be successful and what it means to be important have excluded some other stories, or have excluded Twilight's story from certain spheres and from certain circles. So how do these definitions of what it means to be successful and important really confine history to the powerful, and confine representation to the powerful? I think this is a major question and challenge for us. And it makes me wonder, what are some of the ways that we can work to subvert that privileging of certain histories over others? And how can we redefine what it means to be important, to have a story worth retelling? Because what we look for in history definitely influences what we find. You could go to the next slide. Thank you. So to wrap up a little bit, looking at Alexander Twilight specifically and wondering, like, what can we learn from his story, but also from his values and his legacy, especially on the topic of diverse representation. I think that the complexity of his story can be a really valuable and positive thing, because there's so many different elements and ways of looking at this story. It really gives us a lot to think about. And I think that questions without clear answers can lead to some of the most interesting conversations and investigations into history. And in terms of his own personal values, Alexander Twilight was very clear on the value of education, and with that, the value of open-mindedness. So this re-emphasis on that education is the forum through which stories like Alexander Twilight's can gain a platform and an audience and be reproduced. And I think that's a really important part of his legacy. So that kind of wraps up what I have to say, reflecting on this story. And thank you so much. And if anyone has any questions that they want to ask, feel free to drop them in the chat, or just unmute and shout them out at any of us. We're all, I'm
going to stop my screen sharing here so that we can all see a little bit better. And yeah, we'll have some time for questions now. If anyone has them, I don't know if you want to maybe ask questions of some of us specifically, or ask broader questions, and we can kind of figure out who might be able to best answer them.
So it doesn't look like there are any questions in the chat yet. I'm Victoria at the Vermont Historical Society, and got to work with Rehana this summer, dressed as Raggedy Ann today because it was easy. Oh, there is a question in the chat box. When did Middlebury start claiming Twilight?
Bob, do you have the answer to that at the specific time?
Myself there. I'm off the top of my head, I believe it was back in the 70s when that began. Really, prior to that, we only knew about Twilight's race through word of mouth handed down in the kingdom. But it was never written down, but it was often spoken of. But I think it was in the early 70s when Middlebury started to claim Twilight as their first African-American graduate. Matter of fact, I think that I think back in the 1940s, there was an African-American legislator elected, and the Burlington Free Press put out an article, proclaiming that this was the first African-American to serve in the legislature, and a letter came from the Northeast Kingdom from a woman in Newport saying, "Oh no, back in the 1830s, Brownington sent an African-American to the legislature." So it was kind of passed down through word of mouth, but there was, other than the census records from the town of Corinth saying the family were Black, there wasn't much evidence. After Twilight's father disappeared from the scene, all the members of the Twilight family were ever after listed as white in any censuses that were taken.
So one question, just sort of from a logistical point of view, you have, in the Old Stone House, you have so much more than Twilight's story. Was there any pushback on that in the increased focus on Twilight's story, or how did that go?
I think I can kind of tackle that one, Victoria, and then maybe Bob, if you want, you can weigh in as well. So for our tours this summer, we did still go through the whole museum. Some people were coming sort of, I would venture almost as sort of like a pilgrimage to the site to learn about Twilight. I often had visitors who really specifically were interested in Twilight. And then I had others who had, for lack of a better way to explain it, had sort of fled to northern Vermont for a quiet rural vacation and were looking for something to do and knew nothing about Twilight. So particularly around the birthday celebration, we were able to really focus on him. Usually our tours are sort of like they're guided by a guide, but we sort of let people explore at their pace and we'll gauge the tour to their interests. But I did write a specific Twilight tour to use during the celebration to specifically tell just Twilight's story and sort of integrate it through the whole museum, through the whole stone house. And I think following that, his story sort of got integrated more into the overall theme of the tour. So it wasn't, I don't know that we had pushback from visitors, but we're looking at maybe experimenting next summer because a full tour where you show everything in our building, we have 4 floors, can be quite long and quite, it can cause an exhausting day for our guide. So we're looking at having Twilight's story sort of be the guided tour that you get, and then maybe people doing some sort of hybrid model where people can request to have the full tour, and sort of his being the story, the narrative that we tell, and then having the more sort of broader Orleans County be something that people can sort of explore more based on their interests, if that answers your question. And then Bob, it sounded like you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I think historically, Twilight was always remembered as this dynamic, charismatic, progressive educator who built this amazing 4-story granite building through sheer determination and against the wishes of his board of trustees, and much more so than it's only in later years we've begun to recognize his African-American ancestry. He was even featured, back in the 1950s in an ad for National Life Insurance, in a series of notable Vermonters, and that ad made no mention whatsoever of his racial background. And at the Stonehouse, we also celebrate so many other incredibly wonderful progressive educators, such as Sam Reed Hall was associated with the school, and he taught the first normal school in America and is probably responsible for the blackboard becoming a standard fixture in every classroom in America. When Twilight was up in Canada, we had William Scales, was headmaster, and he was a noted abolitionist and was actually one of the original teachers at the Noyes Academy in Canaan, New Hampshire in the 1830s that was endeavoring to educate both Black and white students in the same school. Tragically, that experiment ended with a bunch of vigilantes pulling the school building down the street and chasing the Black students out of town. But Scales was at the Old Stone House, and it was quite the noted abolitionist. So, you know, we highlight a number of different things, not just Twilight, but he certainly is of major focus.
That relates a little to a question in the chat box. In mentioning that Alexander Twilight did not participate in local abolition groups, were there local abolition groups? What was happening in the Northeast Kingdom?
I'm not well versed in that subject. I have been looking at Michelle Arnosky Sherburne's Abolition and the Underground Railroad in Vermont. And she speaks of you know, active abolition groups in Lunenburg, Littleton, New Hampshire. So certainly abolitionists were active in the Northeast Kingdom, although I was really actually excited. I bought this book because someone put on our website that there was a Twilight reference in it. And I said, oh, maybe she's uncovered some evidence of Twilight being involved in an abolitionist group. And no, she has him featured in a chapter on African Americans in Vermont going by town. And she tells the Twilight story. But again, she didn't uncover any evidence of him being involved in abolition, though we do know from his sermons that he was against slavery. But that's all we know.
I'll also add to that, we do also venture that perhaps Twilight did not encourage people to learn about his racial background. Ironically, at the time that he was accepted to Middlebury College, they were not accepting African-American students. So we venture that he possibly was able to be accepted because of his pale complexion that could be mistaken for someone who was white. So we often wonder if perhaps Twilight chose not to be so outspoken about those issues because and we don't know, we have no idea, this is just our guesses, but that he maybe perhaps was aware that he could use that to his advantage. He didn't want to draw attention to his mixed race background, knowing that he might have more opportunities in the 1830s in the United States if he didn't make that apparent to the people around him.
There is a comment in the chat that Rokeby Museum has a map of anti-slavery societies by date, most of which are on the west side of the state, but some, including Peacham, were among the earliest for abolition or anti-slavery societies. And then there's a little further up in the chat, but Rachel talks about the mundane stories and telling those stories too. And I made a note, this is sort of making me think, in doing education at the Vermont Historical Society, sometimes I do with the students focus on famous stories or famous Vermonters or Vermonters who should be famous, but turning that around, like, is fame, is it important, is it relevant, like how to frame that in a different way of who are people we should know about and why, which related to a lot of what Rehana was saying. But Rachel said for Archives Month, they were looking through the census, 1920 Vermont census records, to identify names of 144 African-American women over the age of 21 to see if they had voted, to, looking at other records to see if they had voted, so that they're uncovering new stories, and have uncovered about 60 of those women so far. So it's an ongoing project, and that'll be interesting to see when that work is available, or how that's. Oh, Rachel says it lives on a Google spreadsheet. And I don't know if you want to talk about this, Rachel, but it sounds like an interesting way of looking at new stories.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. Yeah, I've been excited at the participation of, we've got a group of about 8 people, including some professional genealogists, which helps. But the intent is to, as you say, it's one thing to do the research, and the process itself is a wonderful activity. And I have been thinking about how to get information out about these women and their mundane stories, and what kind of patterns we might be able to see in their stories, and what kind of migration patterns, what kind of family connections. And I've been thinking about having some sort of African Americans in Vermont conference next summer, and of course would absolutely want to partner with VHS and Old Stone House and Rokeby, and this project would just be a little thing there, but it just a little bit more context, and then I'll be quiet. It was inspired by my work with the Vermont Suffrage Centennial Alliance, and a question that we always got was, so tell me about the African-American women, the women of color who were involved in the movement in Vermont. And we just kind of kept saying, there weren't any. And I got really tired of giving that answer. So I wanted to find out, well, how many African-American women were there in Vermont in 1920? And according to the statistics that are published for the 1920 census, there were approximately 144 women identified as Negro in Vermont in 1920. And they kind of broke them down by county, and for the larger towns and cities, how many were in those areas. So yeah, we've got a group that's working through the different counties, and it just, at this point, there's kind of the phase 1 is just finding them in the census and finding the context of the household in which they lived. And because I'm like to be comprehensive, there weren't all that many men either. So we're also gathering the men's names. As long as we're looking through all of these enumerations, we might as well. So we've got them in a separate tab. It's a back burner project. And because they may well connect up with a lot of these women. And then the second phase is to start to look into the lives of these individuals, and to give them shape and texture, and some of these genealogists are just jumping in on that, and we've got some historians and others involved. So it's great, and it started as something to do for Archives Month, because we were casting about at the State Archives and for the Vermont Historical Records Program what we might do, but it's going to be ongoing. So yeah, be in touch with me if you have any interest or you want to learn more.
All right, Wiz has a question about, so granite weighs an average of 200 pounds per cubic foot. How in the world did they move the stone to build the building? I've heard stories about an ox involved, but what the logistics, what do you know about that?
Well, there is some evidence from a postcard from a descendant of a young man who claimed to have often watched twilight and his father at work, and seeing loads of granite being pulled by oxen coming down the road. So it was, transported, using oxen or horses. We do have the ox tail, which, says that Twilight, used this ox. It's pretty well established through oral history that he had, used a series of earthen ramps and so on to move the stones. And recently, I wish I could remember the name of this tool, but evidently there was some kind of a drill that you could drill a hole into the granite blocks and drop in this device that then when you then lifted it with a chain, it would spread out and grip the stone, so that then you could lift these stones into place. If we could use some penetrating radar or x-ray or something of the stones to see if there's a hole in the center, to find out whether they use some of those mechanical lifting devices. But there really isn't a whole lot, known other than what's been passed along through folklore. And there's very little written evidence telling us how it was done. That's part of the ongoing mystery, and what Twilight was known for, of getting this, building this incredible 4-story granite building.
Just to add to that, Victoria, that's a great problem-solving question. So in pre-K, as learning about the Old Stonehouse Museum, I bring in these giant foam blocks, and the kids begin to build something with it. And the problem solving is, how do you build something bigger than you with things that are larger or heavier than you? And so the idea is that the kids will hopefully come up with this idea of ramps, or maybe grabbing a chair, or asking an adult to help them. But that problem solving of that's a question that there's many different answers in how Twilight might have done it in his time, but it's a question that we can pose now to young children to think about how to problem solve. So that was a great question. Thank you.
I do love hearing about the connection, the education connection, and how that's another significant story at the site, and how that's translating into early childhood education and building those foundations. So whether it's STEM or history, that, making those connections that the 3-year-old might not realize that they're learning about history or the Old Stonehouse Museum, but later on, building that ability to get there. And then Heidi mentions that Winfield Scott Montgomery was another early educator from Vermont, and that they're trying to expand on his story at the Historical Society. I don't know if Eileen's going to pop back on momentarily, but it looks like we're almost at 11 o'clock, which is, I think, break time. This was, I think, great. I know Rehana and I have had a lot of conversations this summer about sort of representation and thinking and telling different stories. So I was happy to hear this, and always great to hear how the stories change, what the relevance at different time periods, and what gets highlighted about different stories, and how a historical society can, be true to roots, but also change focus or change interpretation, and maintain relevancy in different ways to the community and beyond. So thank you, great for sharing these stories.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for your questions and comments as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great opportunity to share.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for all the responses and questions and connections that we've been able to make. It's been great.